Greece is set to make payments to the IMF and the ECB later on today. This is in line with last week's accepted bailout deal. Saijil Singh, he's the lead analyst at Coface. He joins Gary and myself for more on that. Saijil, hard decision, or hard question for you maybe. Are we going to be seeing Greece coming to the party and being able to make that payment today?
Today, yes. Long-term debt, I think, is a big problem, but short-term payment for today, definitely so. The ECB has actually set aside some funds and released 7 billion for them to make the payment. So I don't see any realistic chance of them defaulting, seeing that the ECB has provided the funds, and then all they need to do is do a transfer to the IMF.
I always find it interesting that they have given them capital controls there, but yet they still have to make payments, and it's just a very interesting, dynamic that we're sitting there with. Gary?
Yeah, I mean, interesting. Obviously, I think everyone knows that Greek debt is completely unsustainable. I mean, obviously, this is also what Tsipras has been pushing for. He wants a complete restructuring of the debt. I mean, how do you see this going forward? I mean, are we just going to see this flare up again in 2 years' time when eventually this bailout runs out? I mean, or is there ever going to be a sustainable change is anyone going to take their haircuts, and are we actually going to be able to see a sustainable solution in Greece?
Okay, well, I think the first thing regarding the haircuts, trimming off that debt, it's not an option because it sets a precedent. Once you do it for one country, you then have to do it for all the other countries that are quite indebted. Merkel has come out and categorically said no, they will not do that. However, they're looking at other methods or other mechanisms to trim the liability and the burden. It's things like changing the interest rate, so some simple things, but is it going to work? In my opinion, I really, really doubt it. The level of debt has gone beyond the 300 billion mark now. They're looking at another 90 billion that will be released in terms of providing liquidity into the market. And if you were defaulting on a 1 billion payment, a few days, practically 3 weeks ago, what's going to make it so easy for you to make future payments? So what they're actually doing is providing additional debt to make short-term payments. And we know from a basic consumer point of view, you cannot keep on taking out new loans to pay your old loans. It's just bad practice. So realistically, if things stay the way they are, there's no real chance of Greece coming out of this. And all we're doing is further entrenching them into this debt burden.
Saijil, the Greek banks reopening today, does that now remove risk away from the banking system?
Not at all. It's only 3 banks though. It's not all of them. So out of the top 5 banks, it's just 3 that are opening. It's more from a structural point of view that they need to open. They need to ensure that the ATMs have cash in them. They've changed a few laws regarding their form of austerity, where they capital controls on the amount that consumers or individuals can withdraw from ATMs. Now it's not restricted to that €60 mark. However, it's compounded. So if you don't take your €60 today, tomorrow you'll be able to take €120 all the way up to 420. So they're not really changing much, just they're trying to alleviate the burden on the consumer to go to a physical ATM every day. They're trying to alleviate that a bit. And in terms of the actual banking environment, it's a case of making sure operations are running smoothly. People can still utilize the banks externally. The capital controls are more for internal Greek citizens and not for foreigners that come into the country. So they're trying to provide some stimulus into the system, but 3 banks opening is not going to change much. Really.
Maybe shorter queues.
Yeah, shorter queues. But and what is the timeline on the? I mean, how easy is it going to be for them to remove these capital controls now that they've been put in place? I mean, do you have any idea when the Greek system could really be functioning sort of normally again?
Yeah. Last figures we got out of the Greek banks is that there's about 500 million euros worth of cash left in the system, which is ridiculous. That's about 2 weeks supply. So the reality is, if they have to open up and say it's no problem, you can withdraw as much as you have in the bank, in the next 2 weeks the banks will have no cash. So then they'll rely on another liquidity injection in terms of capital funds from the ECB. It's not realistic. In my opinion, it's going to happen maybe in the next 2 months and not very short term. So if the ECB comes to an agreement with the Greeks, if the local populace, if the population agrees to these, very strict measures that are being imposed on them, then we might see some changes and banks opening. But very short term, I don't see a change to these capital control measures.
The population voted no. They did not agree with this. That worries you from a social perspective?
Definitely so. We've seen it in much more underdeveloped nations like North Korea, etc. And I know Greece is quite more mature European market. However, when the population has voted against these form of austerity measures, they've literally said, no, we don't want to do it. and you put your trust in your leader, and he says, yes, I'm taking your cause up to the European Union, and he comes back and says, well, we are now going to go ahead and have further austerity in the country. It's a terrible precedent. What happens then is that you lose your faith in your government, and that's the last straw when it comes to civil unrest. Now, it's not saying people are going to take to the streets and go looting again. That's not it. And there'll obviously be small pockets of that all over Greece at the moment. But it's not a nice environment for the general Greek person. And once they lose hope, you know, we see a number of different problems escalating, especially large businesses that see no future in the economy and want to then move out of Greece into other European countries or other states. And that's a big problem, because then you have huge capital outflows and the economy is just not going to be able to survive like that.
Saijil, thank you so much for coming in, giving us a perspective of where Greece currently is.